Hello, and welcome to a brand new day of free-to-play here on Magic the Gathering Arena. Get the dish on the latest with me, Lord Rumfish. We are diving into the next part of the Deckbuilding Toolbox series. Today we're talking about multicolor cards, or used to call them gold cards back in the day. And for the purposes of this guide, we will also be looking at monocolor cards that have off-color activations. Which is the same thing you'll see if you go to the card search here, and you hit the gold icon. Now when you have all these other colors highlighted and colorless, it would look for a card that has exactly all of these. We're going to look at common and uncommon cards in part 1. There are so many cards to look at that I'm going to break this up into 2 videos. Let's get started. Runic Shot. This is a perfectly serviceable removal piece. At 1 mana, it's about as good as you could ask for destroying target tapped creature. It would be better, obviously, if it was an instant. You don't even really need the kicker cost on this to scry 2. So downsides of this, it means that a creature already tapped, which means it probably already attacked and hit you, or you had to chump block it. The other downside of this card is that the Wandering Emperor is a very important card in the format, and so people play around that card. They value cards that have vigilance. Sometimes they may be shy about attacking your white deck if they think you're going to use the Wandering Emperor, which also affects your Runic Shot. However, that being said, this is just 1 mana to kill a creature. It's a good deal. Rona's Vortex. So you can use this as an offensive-only Fading Hope. You can't bounce something of your own, right? It has to be something you don't control. And it can only be a creature or a planeswalker. But if you kick the spell, you put it on the bottom of the owner's library, and that effectively removes it. In many ways, it removes it more thoroughly than if you'd put it into the graveyard. This is often better than a destroy effect, and it does get around things like indestructible. So Rona's Vortex is an answer that can hit a wide variety of targets and just get rid of it. For that reason, I think if you can play these colors, 1 or 2 copies of Rona's Vortex is a pretty nice answer to have floating around in your deck. You can play it for 1 mana if you need to. Urborg Repossession. This is a neat card. There's a kind of a tough balance to have to try to strike in like a self-mill deck. It doesn't have to be in a mill deck. You might have some other way, like sacrifice or something, that you manage to get cards into your graveyard. But usually in a self-mill deck, you want a really high number of creatures. Which means that every effect like Urborg Repossession, which is a sorcery, that you put into the deck, the less dense with creatures it becomes. It's a bit of a conundrum. Still, I think this card is very good, and probably 1 or 2 copies would be very good for a deck that can support it. The gaining 2 life is nice, and that happens even if the spell isn't kicked. Banalish Sleeper. So it can be a 3/1 for 2 mana. It is a soldier. And there's also the human synergies that exist in Standard as well. And it can enter the battlefield and make each player sacrifice a creature. Sometimes Edict effects, sacrifice effects are amazing, sometimes they are not. There are a lot of token creatures running around Standard. Some of them you might be happy to see go. Like the token created by Fable of the Mirrorbreaker, you might not be too sad about trading for that. Other tokens, like from Wedding Announcement, you will be less happy about running this card against. Overall, this is a neat effect to have access to. for a black-white deck. It's a good budget option. Any card that can play both an offensive role and a removal spell role is something to keep on your radar. Phyrexian Missionary. If it weren't for the existence of a few better rare cards, on a budget, this is a fantastic card that can stymie an aggro deck. They must remove it, must get it out of their way. Or they can't get through on the ground very effectively, and you might be able to race them back with lifelink. And the whole, kicker for a Gravedigger effect, that's a great option to have too. So, if you're on a budget and you're looking for some way to fill out your deck to give you better resistance to an aggressive start, this is a big roadblock to set down in front of an aggro player. And if you have a lifelink, life gain strategy that works as part of your deck, it can be very nice there as well. I think this card is right on the borderline of being generically good, across a wide variety of decks. It really just wants other creatures to play with. Joint Exploration. So this is a pretty reasonable card, even if you don't do the kicker. It helps you find an answer, find the next thing that you're looking for 2 mana. That's not bad. And if you pay the kicker, you can put an additional land card onto the battlefield. So this card, along with potentially Azusa's Many Journeys, if you have a deck with a lot of lands in the mana base, and you're running green-blue and you have Joint Exploration and Azusa's Many Journeys, you could get a lot of lands onto the battlefield quickly by using these 2 cards. I think this card's pretty good. Protect the Negotiators. I mentioned this one mostly for the Soldiers deck. There could be some other blue-white deck, or even maybe a mono-blue deck, that could put this to use. You want a pretty good creature count to make the tax on the spell you're countering to be as high as you can. It's like a tempo play. It's a pretty good tempo play if you've got a press of early creatures and then you want to protect them from a sweeper, let's say. Overall, I'm pretty sure everyone who's watching this, if you've played a decent amount of Standard, you've come up against Soldiers, you've probably played against this card and been blown out by it at some point. It's pretty good. Fires of Victory. So for a blue-red deck, this is a very solid removal spell. It's hard to get a red removal spell that's a 2-mana instant that might kill Sheoldred. This one at least has the potential to. Could also deal a lot of damage to a Planeswalker. So if you're like a blue-red spells deck, maybe a little bit more control-leaning, Fires of Victory could answer a lot of things on the board for you. Sprouting Goblin has not found a home in Standard yet. I think if you pay it with the kicker cost, then, it's like a Civic Wayfinder or whatever. It's a fair card at that point. It also has the ability to pay red, tap, sack a land to draw a card. And I think that's a reasonable effect to have even generically in a deck. If you have a way to get the lands back from your graveyard or otherwise capitalize on that for some reason, it could be even better. But turning your lands into cards is never a bad thing. I think Sprouting Goblin could have a home somewhere. I just don't know what the deck list is yet. I think it's a reasonable tool to have in the toolbox. Tear Asunder. I ended up with 4 copies of this from either the intro decks or the jump-in events. This is a very good card. We have a lot of artifacts and enchantments running around in Standard right now. And doing the kicker for 4, sometimes you really need to get rid of a creature, or a planeswalker. And in that case, yeah, 4 mana is a lot to pay, but Exile is a nice effect to have attached to it. And very often you'll find targets for the front of the card where it's just 2 mana. Overall, I think this is great for a green-black deck. Any deck that can run these colors. You may or may not need all 4 copies. It's very good, though. It kills Thrun. Faithful Mending. This sees some play in Reanimator decks. There are also just some control lists that find this useful. It fills up the graveyard. And that's one of the reasons why it's so good for a Reanimator. The life gain helps to offset what the opponent's doing in the early turns of the game, then hopefully you resolve your reanimation spell, get the thing out of your graveyard. You've been filling up your graveyard nicely and, sort of not getting card advantage, but shaping up your hand to have the perfect mix of spells that you want over the course of time with Faithful Mending. It's a useful and annoying card. It's pretty good. Alice Ilkor, Sadistic Pilgrim. So, I cannot speak ill of the betrothed of one of the other MTG content creators out there, Dev from the Place, Strictly Better Magic. He loves this card. So this is a life gain strategy card. This is also just an aristocrat's win condition. It has some of those same things that the card that's now banned in Standard, Meathook Massacre. This has some of the effect that Meathook Massacre did. So Alice Ilkor can, keep you in the game with life gain, burn the opponent out with life loss. It kind of happens incrementally over time. It sneaks up on them if they're not paying attention to it. They'll get so wrapped up into their game plan that they'll fail to notice what's happening over time with this card. Anyway, she's great. This is a legend you might consider running more than 1 copy of, because you really would like to have her effect on the battlefield in the deck that wants it. Rite of Oblivion. I still think that this is one of the strongest pieces of removal in Standard. It requires a little bit of deck building consideration. You have to jump through the hoop of sacrificing a non-land permanent. Now there are any number of ways to do that. You could have Blood Fountain in black, comes down as a pair of artifacts on turn 1. There's a white creature with flash, enters the battlefield, makes a 1/1 token. There are a lot of ways to get multiple permanents onto the battlefield, or permanents that you don't care about losing, like an Ecologist Terrarium. If you're set up to have a bunch of tokens and multiple permanents running around in your deck, Rite of Oblivion is just a fantastic way to get rid of the most annoying cards that you can't deal with. It's not just an exile removal spell, it's 2 of them, taped onto a single card. I think it's just great. Tainted Indulgence. So this one you may not necessarily craft. Draw 2, discard 1 is fine for the mana cost. It's just fine. Perfectly fair. If you can get the 5 or more mana values in the graveyard, then it's just draw 2 cards for 2 mana. And then it's a little bit unfair at that point. It's kind of above rate. If you can turn on that aspect of this card, then it'll be one of the better cards in your deck. Third Path Iconoclast. So this is a neat budget option for a way to just put win conditions into your spells decks. It lets you go wide in a spells deck. And then there are ways to pump your team in a spells deck. This is just overall a nice card. Nice threat. And the tokens this card makes can block. It's important. Blood Tithe Harvester. I probably don't need to introduce this card. It sees play all over the format. It's just a staple at 2 mana in Rakdos Anvil decks, in beat-down aggressive red-black decks. If anyone's out there still playing vampires, then this card is in there. Grixis plays this card just, always, forever, along with Corpse Appraiser. It's really good. It's also a card that puts 2 permanents onto the battlefield, and that's part of what makes it really good. It's also a removal spell attached to a creature, only at sorcery speed. This is just a great card, all the way around. Hard to argue with, you might be sick of seeing it already. Oni Cold Anvil. This is a great deck. If you haven't tried cobbling this one together yet, and I think one of the intro decks actually focuses on the Oni Cold Anvil. Between that and Jump In, I ended up with 4 copies. Oni Cold Anvil is probably one of the stronger decks you can make really early on in Arena. It's incredibly powerful. It takes a little bit of patience and skill to pilot it, but it makes all of these creatures that can block for you. Then you can sacrifice them at instant speed to drain the opponent for 1, and you gain 1. So for example, if you block their lifelink creature and sacrifice, they never manage to gain life. This can cause them to lose a race against you. And a lot of cards that you get to run in Anvil are just fun. You kind of speed through your deck. I've milled myself out a couple of times playing this deck. You have to be careful. Some of the artifacts that I've talked about in red, when I looked at the red cards, Mishra's Research Desk, and there's also the one from Kamigawa. I forget the name of it just now. But they both exile cards, and then you can play them either that turn or the following turn. Yeah, you just have your foot on the accelerator the whole time you're playing Oni Cold Anvil. Be careful about making your land drop for the turn. Very often you're going to play a land card that you exiled as your land drop for the turn. It's a fun deck to pilot, it's a fun deck to play. There's a couple of cards that it rolls over and dies to in Standard. One of them is Brotherhood's End. If the person playing Brotherhood's End chooses artifacts of mana value 3 or less, you might be able to rebuild the board once. If they cast another one, you're just done. Farewell's kind of the same way. Farewell can really wipe you out. And there's a green card that I looked at in the green video. It gives each player a bear that controlled an artifact or enchantment, then you blow up all artifacts and enchantments, and it rolls over and dies to that card as well. No one runs it, though. So despite having those bad matchups lurking among the play queue, it wins so many other games that it plays. It has so many good matchups, surprisingly good matchups, that it makes up for it. Just great card, great deck overall. It's a good reason to keep an eye out for anything that makes artifact tokens. Sacred Fire. So if you have a red-white deck, especially an aggressive deck, this is, it can go to the face just like Play with Fire. It gains you life, which can help you win a race against another aggro deck. You may not want the full playset of Sacred Fire. You probably won't get to the flashback on it, but you might. Having a couple copies of this for 2 mana is pretty reasonable. Because of cards like Fable of the Mirror Breaker, there are so many 2/2s running around in Standard that could use a bolt to the face. There are some things this won't kill, and that's why I'm not going to recommend you craft all 4 of them, but it's good enough up front, and there's just enough times that the game could stretch out and linger till you have 6 mana, that I think Sacred Fire is a perfectly serviceable card. Join the dance. There's not a wide variety of decks that want this card. If you're playing Jetmir, you know, the Cabaretti Streets of New Capenna deck, then you might end up wanting this card just as a way to make sure you're flooding the board with tokens. It's not the best, it's not the worst either, it's a budget option. Jukai Naturalist. This is a key card of the green-white enchantments deck. Making your enchantments cheaper is very important. This card having lifelink makes it a great target for +1 counters, or from you know, a +X effect. The deck has both of those running around in it. That lifelink helps you race very effectively with the opponent. And the enchantments costing 1 less to cast mean that you storm onto the board quickly, possibly before the opponent can sweep you up or stop you. As I said, sort of a key card of the deck. If you want to play that deck, you need this card. Slaughter Singer. So, since I happen to have a copy of this card, I'll mention that a lot of people are trying to make toxic decks work right now. I think going with, you know, the Poison Ivy deck, green-blue, I think that deck might be a little bit of a trap. I'm not sure that it really works the way that people want it to work consistently enough. You know, it can always have a god drawn, you know, blow you out, but I think if you want a pretty consistent toxic deck, going with a green-white aggro toxic might be what you want. And Slaughter Singer, therefore, might be a great card for that archetype. My problem with cards like this is they don't go in a wide variety of decks. And there's a lot of those that I'm going to mention on this list. But still, this is a pretty serviceable card. Yoshin Dissident. So, I think there's more than one artifact deck you could try to build with this, but mostly, you know, this asks for a very particular kind of deck. And if you do, then they'll start piling in +1 counters across your creatures. I think it could be worth trying to build around. I'm not completely sold on it though. Vilespawn Spider. So this is a really neat card. 2/3 reach for 2 mana. Much like the Phyrexian Missionary being a 2/3 for 2. There are a couple of multicolor rares and mythics that we'll look at that have this kind of stat line. And people play it mostly as anti-aggro tech. These 2/3s for 2 mana that have added value. And these are both in that same ballpark on the budget options. They are 2/3s for 2 with added value. This one, there's some support in blue, right? When you go into Sultai colors, that's green, blue, and black, for a self-mill strategy. You could go not just green-black, you could add blue into the mix, and there will be some cards like the Vilespawn Spider that also want that strategy. So this one is a great blocker early game, not the worst attacker, and you can sacrifice it at sorcery speed to make a big pile of insects. I think this card's pretty good. Good budget option. Courier's Briefcase. So this can see play in green decks. It's not the worst. Ramps your mana for 1 turn. Leaves a creature behind. You could do worse, but in a 5-color deck, then you can also sacrifice this to draw 3 cards, and that's a really nice option to have in a 5-color deck. And so a 5-color deck wants most of what this card is doing. An early game blocker, yeah, it probably needs that. Sacrificing to make a mana of any color, it needs that too. And then once you've got your colors turned on, this card can pay you back by drawing you 3 cards. So kind of whether it's early game or late game, it fills a nice role in a 5-color deck. And if you want to build a 5-color deck, Courier's Briefcase is well worth considering. Heirloom Battle Hymn. So, Sacred Fire and Heirloom Battle Hymn both seem like pretty good burn removal spells that you might like for a red-white deck. So the Battle Hymn can just be 4 damage for 3 mana. You'll use it in that mode and be happy and content with it quite often. But you can kick it up to 4 mana to gain 4 life. And that's a great option too. It can help you win damage races. Unfortunately, this card does not kill Sheoldred, but since you have access to white, white has some neat answers at lower mana costs that can kill Sheoldred. So you don't have to worry about it quite as much with your red spells. And even though this spell is a little bit pricey in terms of mana, the potential to gain 4 life off of it, I think, could be worth it to have a copy or 2 in your deck. Could make a really nice swing in the game from putting you in a position where you're maybe behind, maybe losing a race, to getting you back up to parity. Putting the game back in your favor. I think it's pretty good. Keldon Strike Team. I think Keldon Strike Team is also a pretty playable card, at least for a budget player. So, whether you've done the kicker cost or not, when it enters the battlefield, creatures you control have haste. So it's a 3/1 with haste. It can also, maybe, give other creatures haste. Such as if you paid the kicker cost and you get the white soldiers. So this can be a 3-power creature with haste for 3. It can also be 5 power of creatures with haste for 5. That's not the best against, a creature strategy where the board's getting gummed up. It is really good against a control player, though. They don't want to see haste creatures. They have to, save up all their mana, work at instant speed, and then if this resolves, that's really bad news for them, because now you get in with 3 creatures. They can probably kill the 3/1, but they might not be able to stop the other 2. You keep sneaking damage through while you're doing this and getting more permanents onto the board and getting yourself ahead. If they're trading 1-for-1 spot removal, then this is great. And if they're doing board sweepers, this one card by itself, if their life total's dwindling, they might, cast a board sweeper just to deal with what this one card put onto the battlefield. I think this card's quite good. So I think here as budget options, there are a number of red-white cards that, can make a pretty cool budget deck. Anyway. Elvish Hydromancer. I haven't seen anyone use this card, but it can make a token copy of a creature you control. If you have a ramp deck, then, you know, this isn't the first big creature you play, but maybe you have 1 or 2 copies of this in your deck. If you stick some big creature like a Titan of Industry, and the opponent can't immediately get rid of it, then this would just be a backbreaking play to follow up with. Then you get, a 3/2 plus a whole nother Titan of Industry. That would be putting like 14 power onto the board with that, in addition to the original that you copied. You don't even need a target. You don't need a target that's even that good for the effect. Let's say you just had a budget deck, and you had the 4/4 reach creature for 5 I talked about in my green walkthrough deck building toolbox. So that card lets you look at your top 5. You either gain 4 life or find a creature or enchantment to draw. That would be a wonderful creature to make a token copy of. Get another 4/4 reacher, either draw another card or gain 4 life. Yeah, it doesn't have to be a 7 mana play that you're copying. If you're just copying like a 5 or 6 mana play with this, it's doing great work. So I feel like this card is quite good. I know it could get blown out by removal, but I still think it's a pretty good budget option. Alright, Scout the Wilderness. I run this card in my green-white control deck. So it can just, fetch you up a basic land for 3 mana. It's fine in that regard. It's a little bit below rate if you don't use the kicker. But still, your 2 and 3 mana spells just need to ramp you, and this does that. If you kick this spell, then you also get a couple of blockers, and for a control deck, it's trying to ramp up to its Farewells and its Titans of Industry and all of that jazz. This is a pretty cool card. And because you're a ramp deck, you're more likely, at some stage of the game, to be able to play this for 5. It's good. Markov Purifier, so a life gain deck probably wants at least 1 copy of this to have some sort of a card draw payoff. You might not want 2 copies of it. I could imagine being able to pay 4 mana at your end step, but that's much less likely to happen than being able to pay 2 mana. I think somewhere between 1 to 2 copies is about where you would want to top out with this card. But it's not bad. A 2/3 lifelinker is a pretty good roadblock against aggro. It's better when it's at the 2 mana mark, like the Missionary, but Markov Purifier might also want to run in the same deck with the Missionary. It's not bad. Wandering Mind is a really nice card. I ended up with 4 copies of this from intro decks and jump in. So if you're still building your collection and you haven't gone all in on trying to make a creature-based Grixis deck to where you have Corpse Appraiser and want to cast Corpse Appraiser and can reliably hit a creature with Corpse Appraiser, if you have a more spell-heavy deck, Wandering Mind can be potentially a better 3-drop. It's not as much battlefield presence as a 3/3. It does fly, which is relevant. And it looks 6 cards deep into your library for a non-creature, non-land card. You need a pretty significant portion of spells in your deck to be non-creature, non-lands, but that's not too hard to do if you're running more of a control mid-range strategy. There are a lot of great artifacts, enchantments, instant sorceries, planeswalkers. Overall, this card is good. In practice, I have found this card to be good. This is one of the ways that I took this account and got all the way up to Diamond tier before the season rotated. One of my better decks was a Grixis deck that was running Wandering Mind. Junkyard Genius. This card is so much better than it looks. If you're running an Oni Cold Anvil deck, I am pretty sure you want 2 copies of this. So, like the Blood Tithe Harvester, it comes down, makes an artifact. That's great. You want to be able to sacrifice something to feed the anvil. Keep going wider with your board. If you have 6 mana, I've talked about this before, but if you, let's say you've got 2 Oni Cold Anvils on the battlefield, you have 6 mana, Junkyard Genius comes down, you go ahead and pay the 3, sacrifice the Power Stone you just made. The anvils both trigger in response and make a 1/1. And then he gives them +1/+0 and Menace and Haste, along with your other creatures. Very often, when you've been going wide with your board, you've been draining the opponent, you're in a long game of attrition, suddenly this is the coup de grace. It just comes in and wins you the game. All of that extra power boost and menace and haste with the extra little 1/1s that turn. It's just such a jolt of damage that very often the opponent can't deal with it. I don't know if it's so good and so efficient that you want to run, 4 copies of it, but I think the effect is so strong in the deck you do want 2 copies of it. Lagomos, Hand of Hatred. This is a cool card. This is an Aristocrats type card. It makes you a creature token every turn at combat. So, it makes you a 2/1 red elemental, has trample and haste. You sacrifice it at the next end step. It doesn't say that it must attack. So, if you have no good reason for it to attack in combat, then you can go to combat, make the elemental in your post-combat main phase, then you can sacrifice it, do shenanigans with it. It's not forced to attack, and that's kind of nice. It means that you'll probably have it there to be able to do, post-combat shenanigans. Now, the second ability on Lagomos, I think, is just, kind of a ribbon ability. It's a nice benefit to have, that if 5 or more creatures happened to die this turn, then you get a free demonic tutor by tapping him. I don't expect that to happen much at all. But if the situation did come up, then that would be pretty cool. Maybe with some decayed zombie tokens. You could have that many creatures die. Anyway, give him consideration for your Aristocrats builds. I think this is a really nice card. Generating a creature every turn like this, kind of the way that, the black Ghoul Collar does at 2 mana as a rare. Makes a decayed zombie every turn. Having effects like that in your deck, it just really turns on your Aristocrat strategy to have, these creature factories that don't cost any additional mana. It's really nice to have. Arbalest Engineers. No one talks about this card, but it's good. So, one of the modes on this card is that it comes down and puts a +1/+1 counter on a creature and gives it trample and haste. That can be itself. So, this can be a 3/3 trample haste creature for 3 in red-green. That's, very much in the ballpark of what a red-green deck wants to have. It can also deal 1 damage to any target. Most of the time you'll ping down some annoying critter with 1 toughness, maybe Thalia. There are some other red and soldier cards This could shoot down some tokens it could kill. Or, you know, if the opponent happens to be at 1 life. And that's not even the end of it, right? It can also put the counter on another creature and give it trample and haste. Right, so if a 3/3 with trample and haste can't get through, maybe you can make something else big enough to get through. And it can even make a tapped Power Stone token. So just because of that second mode, where it can be itself a 3/3 trample haste creature for 3, I think this card's good enough. The other modes are additional bonus, added gravy. I think this card is entirely playable, especially for a budget red-green deck. It's good. It's good. I just don't know what else to tell you. Invigorating Hot Spring. I think the time of the monkey tub may be upon us. That's what I called a deck that I built around this card on my other account with. I called it Monkey Tub. So, comes in with 4+1 counters, gives modified creatures you control haste. There are a lot of modified creatures in Standard right now. Notably, this is red-green. Red-green are the colors of oil. In Phyrexia, all will be 1. All those oil creatures with oil counters, now you could consider having them with haste for free. Well, maybe not free. But for, you know, the opportunity cost of playing this Invigorating Hot Spring, you can also, at sorcery speed, once per turn, remove +1 counters from it to put them on creatures you control. So it's not just giving your guys haste, it's also distributing +1 counters, and those +1 counters also give things haste. And there are ways to proliferate, even in green and red. There's actually quite a lot in green. Notably, there's that giant, 4/4 for 3 Trampler in green. When it hits the opponent, you proliferate. It has Toxic 1. That would go quite nicely with Invigorating Hot Spring. So once you start proliferating, this can just put counters out every turn that it's in play. I think there could very much be a Monkey Tub deck. I may have to get around to building this one up again soon with the new cards. Blade, Hold, War Whip. So, this is just an uncommon. Makes a 2/2 double striker, which is a very dangerous creature to have on the battlefield. And the equip cost is very high on this, equipped for 5, but there are ways to force an equipment onto a creature in Standard. Like, what's the new cat? Is it Kimba Ka Regent? Is that an older card? Anyway, there's a 2-mana white cat that equips itself up when it enters the battlefield. There's also a red rare creature that robs all the equipment from your other creatures when it attacks. There's actually, I think a card we're going to look at in the Rares and Mythics part of Gold Cards, Astor, I believe that's his name. And Astor lowers the equip cost of equipment you control to 1 colorless, I think, and Vehicle's Crew for a crew of 1 power. So cards like the Blade, Hold, War Whip, you know, it's pretty reasonable already as a 2/2 double striker. Then if you get Astor on the battlefield, you can equip this around for 1 colorless. That's maybe a deck. That might be a deck. Might be worth playing. Anyway, solid card, something worth considering. Also, all of these 4 Mirrodin cards make 2 permanents. I like that. Sunrise Cavalier. So, if you're making a budget red-white deck, and we've looked at a bunch of good budget red-white cards here. Keldon Strike Team I was singing the praises of earlier. Well, now there's also Sunrise Cavalier. 3/3 Trample Haste for 3. That's great. That makes it almost as good as Arbalest Engineers. I'm kidding out there, Internet. I'm kidding. Still, though, Arbalest Engineers. It's good. Why isn't anyone playing it? But Sunrise Cavalier also starts the day-night cycle, and when day-night flips, it puts a +1 counter on target creature you control. Does not have to be itself. Pretty great. Just a pretty great card all the way around. Very solid for a red-white aggressive deck. Nimble Larcenist. I think with the way that Standard is shaping up at the moment, you have a pretty reasonable chance of hitting an artifact, instant, or sorcery card from an opponent. Let's see. Soldier deck, you'll probably hit one of their little 1/1 artifact soldiers unless they've already committed it to the battlefield. Mono red, you'll probably hit an instant or sorcery card with it. Possibly a rabbit battery that they haven't managed to get out of their hand yet. Other decks, the thing that's nice about this is they don't discard it, they exile it. So if you're looking at, some kind of a Reanimator deck that wants to pull a portal to Phyrexia out of its graveyard, if you happen to catch it while it's in their hand, this exiles it. It doesn't put it in the graveyard for them. You can also take the card they were going to reanimate it with out of their hand. I feel like there's just a number of matchups where you're not the most likely to always hit with this card, but I think you could hit with it often enough that it might be worth considering. It's an uncommon, it's a budget option. Corpse Appraiser, it's quite good. In Best of 3 Magic, this and the Bloodtithe Harvester are kind of best friends. Corpse Appraiser is just all the time appraising the corpses of the Bloodtithe Harvester after it's been killed in combat, sacrificed to kill a creature, got shot down by an opponent's removal spell. This card's just super annoying. It's a solid body on the battlefield. It's looking at the best card out of your top 3 is nice. Putting cards into your graveyard could give you added value. Might feed your additional Corpse Appraisers that way. It's a good card. You can certainly make use of it. Riveteer's Charm. I think out of the Charm cycle, this one and the Broker's Charm are maybe the best. One of the things I really like about Riveteer's Charm is that it can exile a player's graveyard. While that is a niche ability, it comes up enough in this format that it's really, really nice to have it tacked onto a spell that could also be card advantage, right? Exile the top 3 until your next end step, you can play those cards. So you can play this at the end of the opponent's turn to look at the top 3 cards and maybe be able to use all 3 cards. Sacrificing the creature or planeswalker with the highest mana value is also a great mode on this card. Basically, I feel like all 3 modes on this card definitely have their place, and they all add together to make this a really great charm. If you are in these colors, there is some number of this card that you should be running. It's just really good. Broker's Charm. So this card can't be too bad. You can play it as an instant to draw 2 cards. You can also destroy target enchantment. There are plenty of those running around standard. So instant speed enchantment destruction, you might be able to blow up, a wedding announcement before the opponent gets any value out of it. And then, the first mode is the least likely to happen, but it still comes up. Overall, just those last 2 modes on the card make it worth it, so sometimes you also have the first mode. This is a good card. Ligrella the Magpie. So not only can she do the, Annex Century Brutal Cathar type of thing where she temporarily takes an opponent's card, she can also take one of your cards that you might like to see returned to the battlefield. For example, if you have an ambitious farmhand out on the battlefield, Ligrella could snatch it up along with an opponent's creature. And then if the opponent at some point really wants their creature back and kills the Ligrella, then ambitious farmhand comes back, you get another plains, and you could flip it into the 3/3 lifelinker that now has 2 +1 counters on it. Ligrella's pretty nice. Pretty cool card. Rocco, Cabaretti Caterer. Rocco's great. I never see anyone running this card. The handful of times that I have used and cast this card, it has been really good for me. I think that happened mostly in Limited. I don't think I've done a lot of constructed decks with Rocco. There was a time I was trying to make a 5-color deck work with him. Anyway, you search your library for a creature card with mana value X or less. As soon as you hit 1 mana, cast him for 4. You can hit creatures in your library, get 2 bodies onto the field. And it's probably better than a token would have been because it's a real card. At 5 mana, Rocco starts getting some really potent creatures out of your deck and onto the battlefield. Doesn't care what color they are either, right? Rocco could for 5 could fetch up a Blood Tithe Harvester. Now you've got 6 power on the battlefield, and a blood token, and maybe a removal spell. It's just, get up to 3 mana, the sky's the limit. There's so much that Rocco can do. The more mana you have, the better he gets. Maybe eventually there's a point where you've got more mana than your deck needs, but the fact that he's pretty good at, 4, 5, and 6 mana like that means that most decks that run Rocco can probably get a pretty good hit off of him. Those are reasonable spots to hit on the mana curve, reasonable, turns to be able to get to in Standard, as long as you're doing something else on your early turns to get you to this point. I think Rocco is a good card. He's a legend, so I don't know how many copies you want to run, but I think he is a great budget card. Now, it's probably just the 3-color, aspect of this card, and that there are so many exciting rares and mythics is the only reason that people aren't running Rocco. It's really good. I was talking about things that fetch silver bullets out of your deck. Rocco could be another one of those cards that does that kind of thing for you. Alright, Monstrous Warleech. So when I was mentioning a Sultai deck, right, green, blue, and black, that likes to do a self-mill strategy, and I said there were some blue cards that favor it, Vilespawn Spider, it's something you could run in a deck like that. Monstrous Warleech is another. So you don't have to run, you know, silly cards necessarily in your deck to make them a War Leech at a pretty good power and toughness. There are ways to trick a high mana cost card into your graveyard, and maybe you'll just reanimate it later. Or maybe you were planning to get up to 5, 6, 7 mana and cast it someday. Either way, I think it would be pretty easy for the Monstrous War Leech to be a 5/5, 6/6, 7/7, or more when it enters the battlefield. It's a neat card. I think it's not as good as cards like Urborg Lurgoyf and Stickfingers, Old Stickfingers. But those are rares, and this is an uncommon. If you'd like to make a budget Sultai list that does a mill strategy, I think you could do worse than going with Vilespawn Spider, Monstrous War Leech, and crafting a deck. Alright, Sheoldred's Restoration. So this is a 4 mana sorcery that can return a creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. You lose life equal to the creature card's mana cost, unless you pay the kicker cost, in which case you gain that much life. Being able to cast this for 4 mana is a big deal. Right? If you reanimate Atraxa out of your graveyard, and especially if Atraxa hits the opponent even once, then you get 7 life back from lifelink. But even if you don't, drawing that many cards and putting a big battlefield presence on the board that the opponent must deal with is great for 4 mana. And there will be occasions that you cast this for 7 mana. You know, you have the mana to spare, go ahead and gain the life. Yeah, if 7 mana is not a big deal to you at that point, the life gain is really nice just to tack on. Overall, I think this is a good spell. Definitely worth considering. Yoshin Tactician. If you want to make a budget soldiers deck, this is the card. Right here. Comes down turn 4. Instead of, you know, Mural, which might be Mythic, just drop this Yoshin Tactician. Other soldiers get +1/+1. You've been flooding the board with soldiers. Now you've got this uncommon. It's a 3/4, which is a quite respectable body to have on the field. Makes all your other soldiers enormous. Yeah, if you don't have all the rares and mythics, I think this would do just fine for you. It's a card that might just end the game the turn it comes down. Something you have to watch out for with creature lords like this is the opponent can blow out your combat math by removing it at instant speed, but if you make careful attacks, you can account for that if they've got mana open. Ancient Lumberknot. I think there are some neat decks to be built with this card. It's just something to brew around, something to think about. In my colorless crafting guide, I mentioned a card that I was interested in, but I didn't recommend crafting. It's a 0/4 for 2 colorless. Shuts down graveyard shenanigans. That creature doesn't have Defender. It's just a 0/4 for 2 mana. So if you wanted to run that in a deck and still have it be a threat that can, you know, end the game for you, you could run it in an Ancient Lumberknot deck. Now you've hated on the graveyard, you know, shut down things that the opponent might have been depending on. And it can attack as a 4/4 for 2. getting that much added value out of it could be really worth it. If you do make an Ancient Lumberknot deck, you probably want to be sure there's some way you can get an Ancient Lumberknot back from the graveyard if the opponent kills it. Because it's going to be a really important card in your deck. Anyway, I just like this card. I think it's cool. Skyfisher Spider. So if you're doing a self-mill strategy, and you've got some cards like Death Bonnet, Sprout, cards that really want a really high number of creature cards in your graveyard, or Borglorgoyf, etc. Skyfisher Spider is a removal spell, which is a creature. Blow up a non-land permanent. Have to sacrifice another creature to do it, but at least you're getting a 3/3 reach creature at the same time that you get this, destroy effect. And then when it dies, you can either choose to let it go to the graveyard for the synergies in your deck, or you can gain life. And that might also make it pretty good tech against an aggro deck. Right? It's a 3/3, can block flyers. When it dies, it can gain you life. Now, overall, I think this card's pretty nice. I think there's some decks out there, especially budget decks, that want this card. Battery Bearer. I haven't seen anyone play with this card. I don't even know that I've heard anyone talk about this card. So it gives all of your creature the ability to tap for mana. But they tap for mana in the way that a Power Stone does. So it can only cast artifact spells, but you can use it for any other purpose as well. Right? Like paying mana for a counterspell, tax effect, or paying activated abilities on things, paying for triggered abilities. Then whenever you cast an artifact spell with mana value 6 or greater, you draw a card. It feels to me like people enjoy playing big artifacts in this format enough. There could very well be a green-blue deck that would want this card in it. Now, it doesn't really help out mana creatures if you're running mana creatures. So the question is, what creatures are you running in your deck where you have this big artifact ramp deck, where you want the Battery Bearer to have the ability to give them this mana ability? Maybe they're tokens. Or maybe they gained you value in some other way, right? Maybe it's cards like Floriferous Vine Wall that found you a land when they entered the battlefield. I'm not for sure, but I feel like this card could have a deck. I'm not going to recommend that you craft it, but just wanted to point it out. Vivisection Evangelist. If you can turn this card on, if you can get the Corrupted, then this is definitely worth playing even in Constructed. Enters the battlefield, destroy target creature or planeswalker. It is a very nice ability. Unfortunately, you have to be able to turn on Corrupted. Not just any deck can toss this in. So it's kind of a narrow card for that reason. Diagraph Rebirth. So I said Shouldered Restoration was great because it's 4 mana. Diagraph Rebirth is the one reanimation spell in Standard right now that could be even less mana. Costs 1 less for each creature that died this turn. It counts your creatures and the opponent's creatures. And you can flash it back. Really, I think if you have access to these colors, this is the best creature reanimation spell in the format. Might be even better than Sholdred's Restoration. As far as bringing back artifacts and enchantments, or maybe planeswalkers, there are some white cards that do that. But as far as creatures, these two are some great options to look out. Rakish Revelers, this is part of a common creature cycle from Streets of New Capenna, if you're not familiar. All of them have the ability to pay 2 mana at instant speed, if that matters, exile it from your hand, and a land that you control gains the ability to tap for the 3 colors of mana of this card. Right, and there's one for each of the 3-color combinations that were in Streets of New Capenna. So, red, green, white, green, white, blue, blue, black, red, black, red, green, and white, blue, black. So this one, the Cabaretti, I mean, the thing to say about these is that they're all a little bit expensive for what you get. As far as a constructed deck, they're fine and limited. For a constructed deck, all these cards are about 1 or 2 mana more expensive than you would be hoping to pay, probably, for their effect. For a constructed deck. But they all have this neat ability to exile, fix the colors that a land of yours can make, and then you can still cast this spell from exile. Once you cast the spell, the land loses the ability, but that'll be later in the game, and presumably you might have fixed your mana by that point of the game. So, these are neat, they're commons, so it's a neat budget option for being able to fix the mana of any deck you might build, because it's a colorless activation. So for that reason, if you need budget mana fixing, you would rather have more of the lands in your deck come into play untapped, you could run some number of these creatures and get the mana fixing that you need, and still have mid-late game threats. It's an interesting option. As far as Adjudicators is another one. So the Rakish Revelers makes a creature token. That's not bad. It's also, what Cabaretti wants. They want to go wide. As far as Adjudicators, this makes a creature an opponent controls not able to attack or block until your next turn, which you can use offensively or defensively. It's not bad. It can keep you alive. Alright. Let me go ahead and talk about the 5 creatures of this cycle. We'll come back to the Cinderslash Ravager. Glamorous Outlaw. 4/5 for 6, enters the battlefield, deals 2 to the opponent, to each opponent, and you scry 2. Not bad. Could contribute to a game plan where you burn the opponent out with damage. If you're going with a 5-color, burn to the face plan, Maria's Outriders in red cares about the domain for how much damage deals to the opponent. This could be another enters the battlefield trigger in that deck that deals damage to the opponent's face and puts another big creature onto the battlefield. It's a super, super budget option, but it doesn't feel that unreasonable. Masked Bandits. This is just a heck of a beater. Vigilance and Menace. Vigilance, it turns out, is a really nice ability. So, even though this creature is about 1 or 2 mana more than you'd like to pay for it, if you like the color fixing in your deck, it's quite a threat. to put onto the battlefield. And the Shattered Seraph, this is Obscura colors, or you might say Esper. So a 4/4 flyer gains 3 life. Any big creature that gains life when it enters the battlefield is not the worst when you're behind. 7 mana is a lot to pay for this card. But still, a big creature, a big flyer, that gains you life. It's a pretty nice thing to add to the battlefield. All the way around, if you want to use these because they're commons and because they can fix your mana for colorless, and they might make your mana base to where it can come into play untapped, then it's a neat trick, and the cards are not the best, but not the worst either. It's one of the ways to think about that is any card could be bad for its mana value, but once it's on the battlefield, the opponent has to respect it for what it is. Which is to say, they can't snub your Rakish Revelers and say, oh, that's such a terrible card, why would you play that, as they proceed to die, because they don't have a removal spell for it. You have to respect it for what it is once it's come to the battlefield. Whatever mana value it was, whatever tricks you had to do to get it there, once it's there, the opponent has to respect it for what it is. And these cards are not bad once you get them onto the board. Alright, Cinder/Ravager. So this is neat, has Vigilance. As I said, that turns out to be a really nice ability. Enters the battlefield, deals 1 damage to each creature your opponents control. That could be very relevant against an aggro deck, or a deck that's, full of mites or annoying token creatures or something like that. This also costs 1 less to cast for each permanent with an oil counter on it. So, we're not trying to evaluate this for fair at 6 mana. If we're looking at this for a constructed deck, I'm going to assume that you're putting this in an oil deck, and it's not going to cost 6 mana. I think it would be more fair to think of it as costing 4 mana. And a 4 mana 5/5 Vigilance that deals 1 damage to each creature your opponents control. That sounds like a pretty good card to me at 4 mana. Maybe with enough red 1-drops or green 1-drops that have oil, maybe you could get it down for 3. And if you get this down for 3, you're probably doing very well. Anyway, I don't think it goes into every deck. At the 6 mana mark, I think this card is fine. I don't know that it's that much better than these other Streets of New Capenna cards that we just looked at if you cast it for 6. But it's not the worst either. Something to think about for an oil deck. And last card we'll talk about here is Colossal Sky Turtle. So this is not the worst threat to end the game with. A 6/5 flying creature with Ward 2 is quite an annoyance for the opponent to deal with. But that's probably not the way you usually use it. You can channel it for 3. These are both discard abilities. Pay and discard for channel. Return a card from your graveyard to your hand. For instance, this can get back Shigeki. And then Shigeki can get this card back, and it's this endless loop that you get into, where as long as Shigeki can, pay X of 2 or more, you start just netting card advantage as you loop this around with the cards in your graveyard. This is just yet one more reason why exiling the graveyard can be nice in Standard. You can also channel this for blue and 1 to return target creature to its owner's hand. Save something of yourself, or, you know, tempo the opponent with this play. This card in a Shigeki deck is super, super annoying. And eventually, if you choose to, this can be, you know, a 7-mana creature that comes down and wins you the game. At the point that you're comfortable using it that way. Or maybe if you reanimate it out of your graveyard. As I said, there could be a Sultai mill deck. And I don't think Colossal Sky Turtle is the best synergy with that deck. It's certainly not the worst, though. Being able to pull cards back from your graveyard in a mill deck doesn't sound bad. And this is a creature, and it wants a lot of creatures. It wants creatures that act like spells. So, if you're going green, blue, black, maybe this is an option for that deck too. Alright, that brings us to the end of the gold multicolor commons and uncommons. Next time we'll pick up with the rares and mythics that are the multicolors. The gold cards. And that'll finish out the entire deck building toolbox series. So if you've been watching the series with me, I'm going over, you know, sort of a snapshot in time of this particular standard format. But as I talk about all of these cards and all of the potential synergies that they have and different archetypes they could make, I'm hoping that I'm sparking deck ideas for you. And I'm hoping that in the future, if someone watches this video in a different standard, that you'll be able to take this kind of thought process and apply it to whatever cards are in the format at that time. So I hope this video is useful even long from now, far in the future. We'll see. I might make update videos as time goes on to talk about new cards that enter the format or when rotation comes around. But for now, hit like and subscribe if you found any value or entertainment in what I've said today, and stay cool.